ask you is this crisis that's going on in Kenya. Uh, some 250,000 people at least have already been displaced. Another 500 have been killed at least. Um, Approximately 100 people a day are leaving, crossing the borders, and they're now refugees. It's a mess. And it's all because of a fraudulent election and so called democracy. Will you shed some light on this situation?
As with any of the crises going on around the world today, which we're all concerned with, the latest media reports usually don't. I mean, they inform us that there's a crisis going on that maybe we should be paying attention to as well, along with everything else. But it doesn't help us understand the deeper dynamics. And certainly, what we're seeing in Kenya today is a culmination of a crisis that was set in motion before the country's independence. But that I would lay the blame to historical forces. Certainly, in the case of Kenya, the British colonial structure, which relied heavily on using the policy of divide and rule between the different peoples of Kenya.
The so-called tribes.
The so-called tribes, and the word tribe can be used pejoratively, but it's a legitimate term. And then on the other hand, the African power elites, if you like, who also use tribe, they manipulate their own people to further their own personal interests and gain. And so, on the one hand, the crisis is an expression partly of tribal animosity, but that masks deeper issues. Ultimately, it's the same. It's fundamentally the same issue of class that we find everywhere else in the world. Each country will have its peculiar ways in which it manifests itself, and people do express their their unhappiness and the reasons that they perceive for their plight. The easiest way for them to explain it to themselves is through tribe. And then at another level, people understand that the other issue is poverty and the dispossession by the elites. But the elites of Kenya, and in this case, both the person challenging the election and the current president, who are both...
and that's Mwai Kibaki.
Mwai Kibaki, who is the current president in Kenya, and Raila Odinga, who is the challenger in the election, who many believe won the election, which may or may not be the case, and we may never know, because most of the ballots have either been destroyed or in all this chaos. Represents the Luo tribe, which is the other largest tribe in Kenya. But a lot of the other tribes have also sort of united around the Luo against the Kikuyu, who are the largest tribe. So we're seeing what is unfolding is a stalemate, a standoff between the elites of the major tribes, but it really is ultimately a sordid grappling for power and wealth between the elites of Kenya, and the masses of Kenyan people are really the victims. In Kenya, we have this expression: when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers.
It suffers,
and
right.
That's really what we're seeing in Kenya
Exactly.
today. Right.
Right. And the Daniel Moi was the president of Kenya for many, many years, and he ripped them deaf, blind, and stupid, didn't he?
He did, continuing with the pattern set by Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, who was a leader of the independence movement. He was, I guess you could say, in that time in Kenya, people may understand it better by, he served a similar role in Kenya and in that region as I wouldn't necessarily compare him directly into the way in which people appreciate Nelson Mandela today, but there is a superficial comparison there. He had been, interestingly, Jomo Kenyatta was a member of the Fabian Society in England, where he was trained at the London School of Economics. He came back to Kenya and joined the anti-colonial movement, but he was always somewhat close to the British. The real people who fought for Kenya's independence and forced the British to reassess their presence in Kenya was the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau, so-called.
Right. Led by Jomo Kenyatta.
Well, he was not really the leader. He was a leader of the Kenya African National Union, but he was never really a leader of the Mau Mau. He was a political leader of the Kenya African National Union. The leader of the Mau Mau, the military leader, was a fellow called Dedan Kimathi, who was hanged by the British at time of independence. Another key leader of the Mau Mau, of which was the proper name of the Mau Mau, was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, was a fellow actually from India. He was a part of India called Goa. Although he was born in Kenya, part of the Indian diaspora in Kenya, a fellow called Pia Gama Pinto, who was one of the people that Malcolm X met when Malcolm X traveled to Africa. And the Mau Mau were their project was to drive the British off their land, the land of the Kenyan people of the Kikuyu, because they settled in what was Kikuyu land.
I see.
So there was that military struggle, but just as in South Africa, the real fighters against apartheid, not that Nelson Mandela was not, but the people who were militantly for meaningful black majority rule and black nationalism in Africa were marginalized, are marginalized in the current dispensation.
Like Chris Hani.
Right, Chris Hani was murdered.
Right.
And at a certain level, I see the complicity of the ANC nationalist bourgeoisie in Chris Hani's death, at least certainly his marginalization. Likewise, in Kenya, Kenyatta was jailed by the British, just as Mandela was jailed by the South Africans. But they made a deal with Kenyatta to bring him out of jail and preside over the neo-colonial era, to be the leader of the comprador class in Africa, through which the British would take things to the next stage. Because the colonial model, just as the apartheid model, it was outdated. What happened in these countries was that the British and the French, it was an act of enlightened self-interest. They were actually ahead of the game. In other words, they realized that colonialism had, in its phase then, had to end. So they moved several steps ahead. Okay, how are we going to manage the next level? We need so-called indigenous black faces to run it, but they're still the ones running it. So Kenyatta took over.
Just as they're beginning to use black faces to put out front and in diplomatic positions in the United States.
Condoleezza Rice
and possibly Barack Obama might be the next one, who's already talking about invading Pakistan. For goodness sakes.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned briefly before the show, the running joke in Kenya, well, among many, is wondering, because the challenger Raila Odinga in Kenya is a member of the Luo tribe, as is Barack Obama's father.
Okay.
So the joke is, which will be the first country to elect the first Jaluo, the United States or Kenya?